Hello, my friends. Ukraine's war of attrition, corruption, collapse, and the Western illusion. What Western audiences are systematically shielded from is not merely a battlefield reality, but a social and political implosion unfolding inside Ukraine itself. The war is not sustained by popular will, nor by a functioning state, but by coercion, propaganda, and a Western narrative that has long detached itself from facts on the ground. Official Ukrainian figures acknowledge that approximately 300,000 soldiers have deserted or left their units without authorization. Unofficial estimates push that number closer to 500,000. These are not marginal figures. They represent a catastrophic breakdown in morale and legitimacy. Each deserter is not an abstraction. Behind every one of them stands a family, children, parents, spouses, entire communities that no longer believe this war serves their survival or future. Western media remains conspicuously silent on this reality. The reason is simple. Acknowledging mass desertion shatters the myth of Ukrainian unity, resilience, and inexhaustible manpower. It exposes the war not as a heroic national defense, but as a grinding attritional conflict Ukraine cannot sustain. After nearly 4 years of large-scale war, exhaustion defines Ukrainian society. Cities like Odessa experience rolling blackouts without electricity, heating, or water. Zelensky once promised darkness for Moscow. Instead, Ukrainian cities sit in darkness themselves. The war has become a daily ritual of funerals. Military cemeteries that were nearly empty in early 2022 now hold thousands. New cemeteries continue to open. Entire regions measure time not in months, but in casualties. This is not a society eager for endless war. It is a society desperate for survival. The Western narrative insists Ukrainians would rather die than live under Russian control. This is a grotesque fiction. No society chooses mass death as a political preference. Ukrainians want to raise their children, rebuild their lives, and escape perpetual mourning. The idea that the population unanimously embraces martyrdom is a myth carefully cultivated for Western consumption. Corruption has accelerated public disillusionment into outright rage. Revelations surrounding Zelensky's inner circle siphoning Western aid money extracted from Western taxpayers and Ukrainian sacrifice alike have confirmed what many already suspected. While ordinary citizens donate food, labor, and even the last remnants of their pensions to support soldiers, elites enrich themselves. The war has become existential, not for Ukraine as a nation, but for the ruling clique whose political survival depends on its continuation. Zelensky's approval ratings after corruption scandals have reportedly collapsed below 20%. Elections are indefinitely postponed under the pretext of war. This is not democracy under siege. It is power preserved through emergency. Zelensky once promised peace, reform, and a break from oligarchic rule. Instead, he delivered repression, censorship, and endless war while accusing critics of being Russian agents, even as members of his own circle maintain business ties and passports connected to Russia. Dissenting voices are systematically silenced. Western corporate media amplifies only those narratives that align with NATO's strategic messaging. Ukrainians who oppose the war or demand negotiations are rendered invisible, their existence incompatible with the story that Ukraine is defending Europe. This is Euro-Orientalism in practice. Ukrainian lives are treated as expendable instruments in a broader strategy to weaken Russia. European politicians openly scold Ukrainian men for fleeing conscription, demanding they stay and fight because we are paying for this. The implication is unmistakable. Ukrainian blood is a resource to be managed. If European leaders believe this war is necessary, they should send their own children to the front. They do not. The Ukrainian military, despite genuine bravery and adaptation early in the conflict, is now structurally depleted. Manpower shortages are severe. The state's response has been increasingly desperate, recruiting and integrating far-right extremists from across Europe and North America, German, French, American, Russian neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and radical nationalists. their ideology is ignored as long as they are violently anti-Russian. This is a reckless gamble with Europe's future. These individuals are being trained, armed, and normalized. Some occupy command positions. After the war, they will not simply vanish. They will return with combat experience, trauma, grievances, and networks fertile conditions for criminality and terrorism. Europe is financing its own long-term security nightmare. The West has been here before. During the Cold War, intelligence services supported Nazi collaborators and extremist groups solely because they were anti-Russian. Ideology was irrelevant. History is repeating itself with alarming precision. Figures associated with openly neo-Nazi groups are now invited into Western think tanks and policy forums, laundered into respectability. Individuals responsible for pogroms, violent attacks on minorities, journalists, and political opponents are presented as legitimate representatives of Ukraine's military. This is not ignorance. It is deliberate moral blindness. Former Ukrainian military leadership has warned of what follows war: millions of armed, traumatized men returning to an economy in ruins. History, from Vietnam to Afghanistan to World War II, demonstrates that reintegration under such conditions is extraordinarily difficult. Criminal networks flourish. Political violence escalates. The risk of internal conflict, even civil war, becomes real. Yet Western policymakers refuse to engage with these realities. Instead, they cling to symbolic gestures and empty promises. No NATO troops. No no-fly zones. No decisive intervention. Just enough money and weapons to keep the war going, not enough to change its outcome. Even the much-publicized aid packages are insufficient and heavily siphoned by corruption. At the strategic level, Ukraine cannot win a war of attrition against Russia. This is not opinion. It is arithmetic. Russia's industrial capacity, manpower pool, and resource base dwarf Ukraine's. Even Ukrainian leaders have admitted this. The imbalance is structural and irreversible. Meanwhile, discussions of Ukraine's future leadership offer no hope. Figures positioned as alternatives represent the same Western-controlled agenda, often even more radical, particularly those aligned with British strategic thinking, the most aggressively anti-Russian force in Europe. Their vision promises only permanent confrontation, further territorial loss, and demographic collapse. As long as Ukraine remains an explicitly anti-Russian project engineered from outside, it will remain trapped in endless war. This trajectory is not national defense, it is national suicide. The West's embrace of Ukraine is conditional and instrumental. Ukrainian sons and daughters die, while European elites posture, profit, and prepare for a war they have no intention of fighting themselves. The myth of Ukraine defending Europe conceals a far more cynical reality. Ukraine is being used to bleed Russia, regardless of the cost to Ukrainian society. Peace is not betrayal. Negotiation is not surrender. Ending the war is not capitulation to Russia. It is the only path to Ukraine's survival as a functioning nation. History will not be kind to those who prolonged this conflict while pretending it was noble. It will remember the silence, the lies, and the lives wasted to preserve illusions. And illusions, unlike nations, do not bury their dead. Why NATO's escalation options are largely an illusion. The idea that NATO possesses a wide menu of credible escalation options in Ukraine is one of the most persistent myths sustaining the war. It survives not because it is true, but because admitting its falsity would force Western policymakers to confront an uncomfortable reality. NATO has already escalated close to its practical limits without achieving strategic success, and further escalation carries risks it is neither politically nor militarily prepared to absorb. At its core, NATO escalation rhetoric functions as psychological theater. It is designed to reassure domestic audiences, intimidate Russia rhetorically, and sustain Ukrainian resistance long enough to delay political reckoning. What it is not designed to do is win the war. The first illusion is that NATO can escalate incrementally without triggering systemic consequences. In theory, this sounds plausible. More weapons, longer-range missiles, expanded training, deeper intelligence sharing. In practice, this ladder has already been climbed rung by rung. Anti-tank weapons, then artillery, then HIMARS, then long-range cruise missiles, then advanced air defenses, then de facto NATO command integration. Each step was initially described as a red line that would change the war. None did. The reason is structural. Escalation does not change the underlying asymmetry between Russia and Ukraine. Russia is fighting a war on its immediate periphery, with interior lines of communication, domestic production, and strategic depth. NATO is fighting by proxy, constrained by distance, logistics, political fragmentation, and fear of direct confrontation. No amount of incremental escalation reverses that geometry. The second illusion is the belief that NATO can introduce game-changing weapons without assuming responsibility for their use. Long-range missiles, advanced aircraft, or complex integrated systems do not operate themselves. They require targeting data, maintenance, logistics, and operational planning. At a certain threshold, NATO is no longer merely supplying Ukraine, it is co-belligerent in everything but name. Western leaders understand this perfectly, which is why every escalation is paired with restrictions, caveats, and deniability. Missiles are delivered, but with constraints on targets. Aircraft are promised, but delayed indefinitely. Training is provided, but deployment is postponed. Each move is hedged because NATO's real red line is not Russian escalation, it is domestic political accountability for a war spiraling out of control. The third illusion is the idea that NATO unity is solid and scalable. In reality, NATO cohesion weakens as costs rise. Early unity was cheap. Sanctions, speeches, and symbolic arms deliveries carried little immediate burden. As the war drags on, escalation demands real sacrifices. Depleted stockpiles, strained defense budgets, industrial bottlenecks, and growing public fatigue. European militaries are discovering the decades of hollowing out cannot be reversed overnight. Ammunition production is insufficient, air defense inventories are thin, readiness levels are uneven. NATO is not a war-fighting alliance in the sense it once imagined itself to be. It is a political alliance attempting to relearn industrial warfare, while pretending it already has mastery of it. The fourth illusion concerns nuclear brinkmanship. Some Western strategists flirt with the idea that Russia's nuclear warnings are bluffs, that escalation dominance remains with NATO. This is a dangerous misreading. Nuclear deterrence does not require intent to use nuclear weapons at every stage. It requires credibility at the margins. Russia's nuclear posture is defensive but explicit. Existential threats will be met with existential responses. NATO, by contrast, has no appetite for nuclear escalation over Ukraine. None. The populations of Europe and North America have not been prepared psychologically, politically, or materially for even the possibility of nuclear confrontation. This asymmetry alone caps NATO escalation long before it reaches Russia's thresholds. The fifth illusion is the fantasy of NATO boots on the ground under some euphemism, peacekeepers, security guarantees, coalition forces. This is perhaps the clearest example of rhetorical inflation. Any deployment of NATO troops into Ukraine would immediately transform the war into a direct NATO-Russia conflict. There is no legal, semantic, or diplomatic trick that changes this fact. Western leaders know this, which is why such proposals appear only in opinion columns and think tank panels, never in concrete planning documents. The distance between what is said and what is done is not accidental. It is the gap between fantasy and survivability. The sixth illusion is economic warfare as a substitute for military victory. Sanctions were supposed to cripple Russia's economy, spark domestic unrest, and force strategic retreat. Instead, Russia adapted, rerouted trade, stabilized its currency, and expanded military production. Meanwhile, Europe absorbed energy shocks, inflation, and industrial decline. Economic warfare did not collapse Russia. It exposed Europe's vulnerabilities. Escalating sanctions further now risks diminishing returns and internal backlash, not decisive outcomes. Underlying all these illusions is the most important one, that time favors NATO. It does not. Time favors the side with greater strategic patience, industrial capacity, and social resilience. Russia is mobilized for a long war. NATO is managing a political crisis cycle. Ukraine is being consumed in between. Every escalation NATO contemplates worsens Ukraine's long-term position without resolving the war. More weapons mean more destruction. Longer war means fewer Ukrainians, less infrastructure, deeper trauma, and a weaker post-war state. Escalation is not a path to victory. It is a mechanism for postponing defeat while increasing the cost of acknowledgement. In this sense, NATO escalation options are illusory, not because NATO lacks power, but because it lacks freedom of action. Power constrained by fear, fragmentation, and denial is not decisive power. It is performative power. The strategic reality is stark. NATO cannot escalate enough to defeat Russia without risking a war it does not want and cannot politically sustain. Russia does not need to escalate symmetrically. It only needs to endure. Ukraine, trapped between these asymmetries, pays the price. The tragedy is that illusions persist precisely because abandoning them would force a reckoning with negotiation, compromise, and the limits of Western influence. Escalation myths are easier than strategy. They delay accountability. They preserve narratives. But wars are not won by narratives. They are ended when illusions finally collide with reality. To understand why NATO's escalation options are mostly illusory, one must abandon the surface-level discussion of weapons systems and move into the deeper terrain of political will, strategic culture, and systemic risk tolerance. Wars between nuclear-armed blocs are not decided by hardware alone. They are decided by who can absorb uncertainty, who can endure prolonged strain, and who is willing to accept catastrophic risk. On all three counts, NATO is fundamentally constrained. The most critical limitation NATO faces is not military capability, but political fragility. NATO is not a unitary actor. It is a coalition of states with divergent threat perceptions, economic conditions, electoral cycles, and historical memories. Escalation requires consensus not once, but continuously. Every additional step upward multiplies internal friction. This is why escalation appears bold in rhetoric but hesitant in execution. Russia, by contrast, operates under a centralized decision-making structure with a long-established strategic culture shaped by existential wars. Its leadership assumes conflict with the West is structural, not episodic. NATO leadership treats Ukraine as a crisis to be managed. Russia treats it as a security settlement to be enforced. This asymmetry alone defines the ceiling of NATO escalation. Another illusion lies in the belief that escalation can remain reversible. Western policymakers speak as if escalation is a dial that can be turned up or down at will. History suggests otherwise. Escalation in high-intensity warfare creates path dependence. Once advanced systems are introduced, once intelligence integration deepens, once personnel become embedded, disengagement becomes politically humiliating and strategically dangerous. This is precisely why NATO hesitates at each step, not because escalation is impossible, but because it is irreversible in ways leaders cannot publicly acknowledge. Acknowledging that would require admitting loss of control, something no political system built on electoral legitimacy can afford. There is also a profound misunderstanding in Western discourse about deterrent symmetry. NATO assumes that because it possesses overwhelming aggregate power, it holds escalation dominance. But deterrence is not about totals. It is about thresholds. Russia's escalation thresholds are lower because the war is local and existential from its perspective. NATO's thresholds are higher because the war is distant and optional. This means Russia does not need to match NATO escalation step for step. It only needs to signal that beyond a certain point, the cost becomes unacceptable. NATO, knowing this, self-deters. This is not weakness. It is rational behavior. But it renders much of the escalation rhetoric hollow. The illusion deepens when analysts discuss Ukrainian victory without defining what victory means. Is it territorial restoration to 1,991 borders? Regime change in Moscow? Permanent NATO alignment? Each of these outcomes would require a level of escalation NATO has no intention of pursuing. Victory is spoken of as a moral abstraction, not a strategic endpoint. In reality, NATO's actions reveal a different objective: conflict management, not victory. The goal is to weaken Russia over time while avoiding direct confrontation, to maintain alliance credibility while preventing escalation beyond control, and to shift costs onto Ukraine while preserving Western stability. This is not conspiracy. It is structural logic. The problem is that conflict management for NATO translates into societal exhaustion for Ukraine. Every month the war continues, depletes Ukraine demographically, economically, and institutionally. Escalation prolongs this depletion without altering the outcome. It creates the appearance of agency while removing Ukraine's ability to choose peace independently. Another often ignored dimension is industrial time. NATO escalation assumes that Western defense industries can scale fast enough to sustain high-intensity warfare. This assumption is false. Production timelines are measured in years, not months. Skilled labor shortages, supply chain dependencies, environmental regulations, and budget politics all constrain output. Russia entered this war with an economy already adapted to sanctions and mobilization. NATO is trying to reindustrialize under peacetime political constraints. This mismatch cannot be fixed through escalation. It only becomes more visible over time. There's also the psychological illusion of moral insulation. Western leaders frame escalation as virtuous because it is indirect. Ukrainian deaths are tragic but externalized. This creates a moral hazard. Decisions that would be politically impossible if Western soldiers were dying become acceptable when Ukrainians die instead. But this insulation is not permanent. As casualties mount and refugees remain abroad, Ukrainian society fragments. When Ukraine eventually confronts defeat or forced compromise, resentment will not vanish. It will metastasize against domestic elites, against Europe, against the very states that encouraged maximalist goals while refusing maximal risk. Escalation thus carries a post-war instability cost that NATO has not calculated. A militarized, traumatized, economically broken Ukraine is not a strategic asset. It is a long-term liability. No escalation option addresses this reality. Perhaps the deepest illusion of all is that escalation preserves credibility. In fact, failed escalation erodes credibility faster than restraint. Each red line that dissolves, each game changer that fails to change the game, teaches adversaries that Western power is loud but cautious. Russia learns this. China learns this. The global South learns this. Credibility is not maintained by motion. It is maintained by coherence. NATO escalation in Ukraine lacks a coherent end state. It is reactive, not strategic. It is driven by fear of reputational loss rather than clarity of purpose. This is why escalation options exist mostly in speeches, leaks, and think tank simulations. They are tools of narrative maintenance, not war-winning instruments. They allow leaders to say we are doing something without confronting what they are unwilling to do. The war persists not because NATO cannot end it, but because ending it requires admitting limits. Limits of power, limits of influence, limits of moral certainty. Escalation myths postpone that admission. In the end, escalation is an illusion because it promises control in a situation defined by uncontrollability. It suggests mastery where there is only management choice, where there is only trade-off, victory where there is only settlement. And wars like this do not end when one side finally escalates enough. They end when one side finally accepts reality.